Imagine a world so gilded, so interconnected, that its very existence felt utterly eternal. This was the Late Bronze Age, a magnificent era where the pharaohs of Egypt exchanged love letters written in solid gold with the great kings of the Hittites, where the ships of Mycenae sailed trade routes as familiar as your own morning commute, carrying precious tin, exotic copper, and fine oil across the vast sapphire ocean. This was the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, a delicate, sprawling network of power, commerce, and magnificent palaces that stretched from the Aegean Sea all the way to the Mesopotamian plains, a true, unbreakable global civilization. This wasn't just a golden age. It was a fortress built of solid, unassailable prosperity, cemented by centuries of diplomatic marriage and mutual economic dependency. No one, absolutely no one, could have predicted that this entire structure, this millennia-in-the-making edifice of sophisticated human life, was about to be obliterated, annihilated, not by internal squabbling, but by a terrifying shadow that crept silently in from the deepest reaches of the sea. A catastrophe so profound, so absolute in its destruction, that historians still refer to it simply as the moment the lights went out across the ancient world. We are talking about the Great Bronze Age collapse, the first documented global dark age, a terrifying period of unparalleled regression. Can you believe that the most powerful, most technologically advanced, and most geographically dispersed societies on Earth simply stopped existing in the span of a single generation? The magnificent, immortal Hittite capital, Hattusa, which had endured for centuries, vanished entirely under a layer of ash and rubble. Its royal archives shattered, its mighty gods silenced forever. The opulent, seemingly invincible fortified citadels of Mycenae, the legendary home of heroes like Agamemnon, were systematically and brutally burned to the ground, their cyclopean walls proving tragically useless against an enemy no one could truly identify, much less stop or defeat. We are not talking about a mere change in political leadership or a swift palace coup. We are talking about the complete and total annihilation of societal memory, the destruction of literacy itself, and the fundamental collapse of critical infrastructure across 3 continents. Bronze tools, the height of technology, were suddenly replaced by cruder, inferior iron implements. Grand palaces were abandoned in favor of meager, pathetic shantytowns. The knowledge of reading and writing, once the pride of highly trained royal scribes, became a lost and forgotten art in vast regions for the next 400 agonizing years. Civilization, as they knew it, simply ceased to function. But who held the torch that lit this colossal funeral pyre? What dark, relentless force was so terrifyingly effective, so surgically precise, that it could simultaneously dismantle every major power center and trade hub from Greece down to Gaza? The answer, etched in the crumbling, dusty reliefs of the monumental Egyptian temples, is perhaps the most chilling and mysterious phrase in all of ancient history: the Sea Peoples. They appeared almost literally out of nowhere, riding the powerful waves like a plague sent forth by angry, vengeful gods. A terrifying, constantly shifting coalition of hardened warriors, desperate migrants, and ruthless pirates, whose strange names, Peliset, Sheridan, Checker, Ekwesh, still echo today with the dreadful, unmistakable sound of breaking civilizations and shattered empires. Their collective identity remains arguably one of the greatest archaeological mysteries ever conceived. A cold case spanning more than 3,000 long years of speculation and debate. Were these people simply desperate refugees, fleeing catastrophic famine and severe drought in their unnamed homeland, pushed far beyond the brink of survival and forced by circumstance to become destroyers? Or were they perhaps highly organized, coordinated military units executing a strategic, multi-front war designed specifically to dismantle the global trade economy and seize critical coastal access points for future dominance? The truth, as always, is buried deep beneath the sand, obscured by the very catastrophe they initiated. Imagine the horror. Entire fleets of vital merchant vessels disappearing instantly without a trace, only to reappear weeks later filled to the brim with hardened, bloodthirsty invaders. Cities fell one after the other, not in months of agonizing siege, but in mere days, sometimes hours. The delicate communication lines that had bound the entire Bronze Age world together, the diplomatic couriers, the royal gift exchanges, snapped entirely and irrevocably, leaving every king stranded, isolated, and terrified, facing the end of their world completely alone. The sheer terror was palpable, radiating outwards from every coastline and major port. Ugarit, a thriving, glorious port city built on international trade, sent agonizing, final messages to its distant allies. Desperate letters describing how the Sea People's massive ships were already visible on the horizon, how their defense forces were rapidly failing, and how the internal structures of the city were tragically crumbling under the combined pressure of famine, invasion, and sheer panic. The last known letters from Ugarit detailed the city's final, terrifying moments of chaos before the absolute, crushing silence descended, never to lift. This is far beyond just ancient history. This is the definitive, terrifying thriller of the ancient world. A story of mass migration, total systemic collapse, and global warfare fought by an enemy that vanished as quickly as it appeared. It is the chilling story of how global society, even at its most powerful, can be shattered by a force so fluid, so decentralized, yet so utterly deadly, that it leaves behind nothing but ruins, ashes, and thousands of years of unanswered, haunting questions. Tonight, my friends, we are going to dive deep, deep into the darkness, tracking every single clue, every archaeological shard, and every terrifying inscription left by the greatest enigma of antiquity. We will trace the shocking journey of the Sheridan, those infamous warriors known for their distinctive horned helmets and massive round shields, who began their career as trusted mercenaries for the great powers, only to turn against their paymasters with brutal, shocking efficiency, becoming the very instrument of their downfall. We will meticulously examine the identity of the Palisade, the group whose legacy is arguably the most recognizable and enduring, yet whose true origins are still fiercely and bitterly debated among every single scholar working today. We will seek the truth of the Chequer, the mysterious group who settled and then dominated the coast of the Levant, and the Eqwesh, whose possible connection to the legendary Achaeans of Homer's epic tales could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the fall of Troy and the Mycenaean world. Get ready to witness the catastrophic fall of empires, the sudden, silent death of the highly advanced Mycenaean civilization, and the agonizing, brutal struggle of the new kingdom of Egypt to hold back the irresistible tidal wave of destruction and total societal obliteration. This story isn't just about who the Sea Peoples were in life. It's about the terrifying, sobering realization that even the strongest societies are built entirely on foundations of fine sand, and that sometimes the greatest, most absolute enemy is the one you never saw coming, appearing abruptly and menacingly on the far horizon where the sea meets the darkening sky. Prepare yourself, because the mystery of the Sea Peoples is about to violently unfold. The year is roughly 1200 BCE, and the entire world, the magnificent tapestry of civilization woven over 2,000 years, is about to be ripped apart. Palaces that stood for centuries, the gleaming citadels of Mycenae, the bustling trade hubs of Ugarit, the colossal cities of the Hittites, they all went dark. This was not a slow decline, not a measured recession. It was a total, violent system crash, a global apocalypse where the lights flickered out across the entire known world, plunging the Mediterranean basin into 400 years of historical illiteracy and terror, known simply as the Dark Ages. Suddenly, the meticulously documented records of diplomacy, trade, and royal correspondence, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, cease. It is the greatest silence in ancient history, broken only by the frantic screams of the few who managed to survive the initial wave of destruction, and the stone-etched warnings of one powerful entity that stood against the tide: Egypt. The pharaohs, the eternal rulers of the Nile, documented the terror in stone, etching their desperate struggle against this invading menace into the very granite of their massive temples. We owe our very knowledge of this catastrophe and the existence of the Sea Peoples themselves to these specific, monumental pieces of evidence that survived the inferno: the chilling Marantaw stele and the monumental battle reliefs carved into the walls of Medinet Habu. Imagine the shock of the Egyptian scribes as they wrote down foreign names that had no context, names that sounded like death rattles: the Peliset, the Chequer, the Denyen, the Weshesh, the Sheridan. These were not mere neighboring armies. This was an unholy. Imagine the shock of the Egyptian scribes as they wrote down foreign names that had no context, names that sounded like death rattles: the Peliset, the Checker, the Denyen, the Weshesh, the Sheridan. These were not mere neighboring armies. This was an unholy, terrifying coalition drawn from the shattered remnants of the collapsing world, armed with desperation and an unknown, apocalyptic intent. The Merintah Stele, dating back to 1207 BCE, sounds the first desperate alarm bell, noting the successful defeat of a massive Libyan coalition that dared to cross the Nile Delta. But lurking within that coalition, like poison in the well, were the earliest confirmed elements of the Sea Peoples, groups like the fierce Sheridan and the dreaded Luca, already known as hardened, ruthless pirates and mercenaries. These Sheridan were recognizable by their massive, round shields and their iconic, terrifying helmets, often adorned with horns or discs. They were the shock troops, the unstoppable infantry that Egypt had occasionally hired, now turned violently against their former employers. But this was merely the prelude, the first tremor before the true earthquake that would define the end of the Bronze Age. The true masterpiece of recorded horror, however, comes later, under the long reign of Ramesses III, etched into the glorious, protective walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Here, the story shifts from a border skirmish to an existential, total war for the very survival of the Egyptian state, a clash that would determine if civilization itself would continue. Ramesses III documented the horror in vivid, exaggerated detail, showing a terrifying, two-pronged assault that struck fear into the heart of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. First, the land armies, enormous columns of people dragging ox carts piled high with their entire families and every meager possession they owned. They weren't just warriors seeking plunder. They were entire displaced nations, fleeing a cataclysm we still struggle to define, desperate migrants looking for a new home and willing to obliterate anything that stood in their way. Their movements were not military maneuvers. They were migrations of desperation, driven by a terrible hunger. The sheer scale of this land invasion suggested that the collapse was already complete in their homelands, wherever those mysterious lands might be: Mycenae, the Aegean Islands, maybe even deep in Anatolia. They brought the entire destruction of their former lives with them, ready to inflict it upon Egypt's rich, fertile lands. And then the true nightmare: the ships. Ramesses III documented the naval battle in the waters of the Nile Delta, showing the terrifying sight of these sleek, high-prowed vessels, the ships of the Peliset and the Checker, sailing down upon the unsuspecting Egyptian fleet. These sea people's ships were laden with warriors wearing breastplates and distinctive feathered headdresses, engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat against the desperate Egyptian defenders. The naval battle reliefs are a document of raw violence, depicting Egyptian archers raining arrows down, trying to repel the boarders, before they could even set foot on Egyptian soil. The Egyptians fought with every fiber of their being, knowing that if the naval defense failed, the floodgates would open and the sea peoples would consume the delta, ending the new kingdom and perhaps all of organized life along the Nile. Ramesses III fought fiercely, claiming a decisive victory, a victory that saved Egypt, but could not save the rest of the world. He boasts of capturing and slaughtering the invaders, turning the tides of the battle. But even in his triumphant reliefs, there is a clear, haunting admission. He only repelled them. He did not destroy the threat entirely. He recorded their devastating names for posterity, but he did not record their origins, leaving us with the most terrifying question of the Bronze Age. Where did these apocalyptic invaders truly come from? And why did they appear all at once to burn the world down? The silence of the historical record is not a lack of evidence, but a terrifying warning. Because when the smoke finally cleared, and the historians tried to piece together the shredded map of the ancient world, they found their answer not in a unified nation, but in a catastrophic trail of destruction, stretching from Mycenae to the gates of Egypt itself. The story of the Sea Peoples is not the story of a conquest. It is the blueprint for global annihilation, written in the ashes of the greatest cities the world had ever known. But the devastation didn't happen in a single clean strike. It was a slow, agonizing death for the global system, beginning with faint tremors that the superpowers arrogantly ignored, dismissing them as localized banditry or minor skirmishes on the periphery of their expansive empires. Yet the warnings were there, etched into the diplomatic correspondence between the kings, desperate, frantic letters describing ships of unknown design appearing on the horizons, faster and more ruthless than any pirate known before. The first truly concrete evidence, the inscription that ripped the veil off the encroaching darkness, came from the one civilization that managed, barely, to stand against the tide: Egypt. It was in the 5th year of the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, around 1208 BCE, that the nightmare finally reached the fertile banks of the Nile, not as a subtle raid, but as a massive, organized invasion, aimed squarely at the heart of the kingdom. This was not merely the Sea Peoples acting alone. They were allied with the Libu and the Mishwesh, powerful Libyan tribes who saw the chaos as a perfect opportunity to loot the riches of the delta. But even the Egyptians, seasoned veterans of countless wars, recorded the Sea Peoples component of this invading army with a chilling sense of dread, listing their terrifying coalition of names. They named them the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Luka, the Shekelesh, and most famously, the Sherden. These names are not just ancient labels. They are the terrifying key to understanding the sheer diversity and mystery of the invaders, suggesting they were drawn from across the entire Mediterranean basin, united by a singular destructive purpose. The stele describes how the land of Hatti was already pacified, a polite scribal term that likely meant utterly destroyed. and how the land of Canaan was suffering immense internal strife and political collapse. This inscription provides the critical timestamp. By 1208 BCE, the systemic collapse of the Late Bronze Age was already well underway, and the Sea Peoples were the undeniable trigger. The Shurden, listed prominently, are one of the most enigmatic groups. Equipped with distinctive round shields and long slashing swords, they were perhaps the most recognizable maritime warriors of the era, and they had appeared intermittently in Egyptian records even before the collapse, often hired as mercenaries by the very pharaohs they would later threaten. The mystery deepens when we consider the Luca, often associated with the region of Lycia in Anatolia. These were long-standing, aggressive pirates who had plagued the Hittite Empire for centuries. But now, they weren't just raiding. They were participating in a coordinated, massive military operation, signaling a terrifying shift from opportunistic piracy to a strategic, unified military action. And the Teresh, some historians desperately link them to the inhabitants of Lydia, while the Shekelesh are often tied to Sicily. What must be understood is that these were not cohesive national armies like the Egyptians or the Hittites. They were desperate, highly mobile maritime factions, perhaps driven by famine, environmental disaster, or simply the irresistible lure of the rich, ripe civilizations waiting to be harvested. The sheer geographical scope of their presumed origins proves that the crisis was fundamentally decentralized, a simultaneous implosion across the entire region that drove populations onto the seas. It wasn't one great king raising an army. It was the world itself fracturing and disgorging its refugees and warriors onto the water. Imagine the scene in Ugarit, the shining coastal city of Canaan, a vital hub of international trade, where massive warehouses held goods from Crete, Babylon, and Cyprus. They were the Venice of the Late Bronze Age, masters of commerce, utterly dependent on a stable global economy. Then, the communication stopped. We know this because archaeologists found the final, desperate correspondence of the king of Ugarit, Hammurapi, preserved in the city's burnt archives. He wrote frantic letters to his neighbors, begging for help, describing how his own fleet was away defending the coast of Lycia, and now the enemy was upon them, already attacking his people in the countryside. The letter is a chilling epitaph for an entire civilization. Hammurapi wrote, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, some of my cities they burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are stationed in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are stationed in the land of Lucca?" He was utterly exposed, his defensive resources pulled away to fight a war on foreign soil that ultimately did not matter, because the true enemy was already sailing toward his unprotected capital. This single text captures the true horror of the Sea Peoples. They exploited the fundamental interconnectedness of the Bronze Age world, hitting the soft underbelly while the great armies were distracted. The subsequent destruction of Ugarit was total. The city was incinerated, never to be rebuilt. The ruins piled high in layers of ash and destruction that tell a story of rapid, violent collapse. And Ugarit was just the first domino in a line that stretched all the way to the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, Hattusa, the heart of an ancient superpower. The terrifying efficiency and speed of this destruction suggested that the Sea Peoples were not just pirates. They were perhaps the shock troops of a much larger, global catastrophe, leveraging the existing trade routes, not for commerce, but for mass destruction. But the ultimate prize, the final confirmation that the Age of Kings was over, would be the fall of the Hittites themselves. A superpower so vast, so organized, that its sudden disappearance from the map remains one of history's most profound and shocking mysteries. And the Sea Peoples were waiting at the gate. The waiting was over. The gates did not just creak open. They were violently ripped from their hinges by a force history had never anticipated. A destructive wave that crashed first upon the shores of the Aegean and then surged eastward, seeking the very heartlands of the great superpowers. The collapse of Mycenae was merely the prelude, the opening act of an apocalypse. The true test of this destructive machine, this terrifying alliance known as the Sea Peoples, would come against the mighty Hittite Empire, the undisputed master of Anatolia, and the chief rival to Egypt itself. Imagine the capital city of Hattusa, nestled high on the central plateau, a magnificent metropolis of stone and iron, guarded by cyclopean walls that stood 30 feet thick in places, believed to be utterly impregnable by man or God, the very heart of the empire that had codified ancient law and perfected chariot warfare. But impregnable means nothing to famine, drought, and a relentless, organized enemy attacking from multiple vectors at once. The Hittite archives, those meticulously catalogued clay tablets detailing the kingdom's life, suddenly fall completely silent right around the year 1200 BCE, leaving historians with a terrifying historical black hole. It's not just a footnote, it's an entire library, an entire civilization's voice, abruptly muted forever. The archaeological evidence unearthed at Hattusa tells a story far more brutal than any text could. The city was not merely conquered and subjugated. It was utterly abandoned, its archives smashed, its great temples left to crumble into dust, never to be reoccupied again by a people of equal sophistication. The destruction was absolute, suggesting not just a territorial invasion, but a strategic campaign of total eradication, a cleansing of the landscape to make way for new settlements, or perhaps driven by a vengeful fury we can no longer comprehend. Who were these destroyers who could humble the great king of Hatti, the ruler whose very name meant geopolitical power across the entirety of the Near East? We must turn our eyes now to Egypt, the only major state wealthy and powerful enough and, crucially, geographically protected enough by the vast deserts to document the catastrophe unfolding around them. They are the eyewitnesses, trembling behind their fortifications while the world burns, recording the terrifying details for posterity. It is in the majestic mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu that the terrifying roster of names is etched forever in stone, a death list of civilizations and peoples who came to shatter the ancient order and wipe the slate clean. These are the sea peoples, and Egypt gives us their names, though not their definitive origins. We hear first of the Peliset, perhaps the most famous, destined to become the Philistines of biblical fame, bringing their distinctive Aegean material culture, their sophisticated pottery, and their unique burial traditions to the shores of Canaan, permanently altering the region's demographic makeup. Then there are the Checker, known especially for their naval prowess, setting up a powerful temporary stronghold at the crucial port of Dor, cementing their iron-fisted control over vital maritime trade routes that had sustained the Bronze Age economy for centuries, strangling the remnants of civilization. The Shekelesh and the ferocious Sheridan were also listed. The Sheridan specifically noted for their distinctive horned helmets and large round shields, warriors often employed as elite mercenaries before the collapse, only to turn ruthlessly on their former employers when the system finally began to fracture and the opportunity for plunder arose. These groups were not just disorganized pirates relying on brute force. They were clearly a highly effective coalition, perhaps forced together by the very famine and drought that was crippling the settled empires, or perhaps driven by a shared destructive purpose that still eludes historians today, acting with military precision. Ramesses III describes the scene with chilling clarity, noting that no land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia. They were cut off at one time, confirming a rapid, simultaneous, and overwhelming wave of destruction across the entire region. This synchronized list is proof, a sudden, devastating domino effect of catastrophic failure sweeping across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin, demonstrating that the sea peoples weren't just attacking, they were systematically erasing the geopolitical map and rewriting the rules of human settlement. But the collapse was not purely military. It was, at its core, a systemic failure of a highly specialized and intensely centralized global economy. The late Bronze Age was an era of radical interdependence, a massive network of trade flowing across the sea lanes, linking Egyptian gold to Mycenaean olive oil and Mesopotamian texts to Hittite iron. The single most fatal choke point was the supply of bronze itself, the indispensable alloy of the age. Bronze requires two key ingredients: copper, largely sourced from the island of Alashia, Cyprus, and tin, sourced from as far away as Central Asia, and possibly even the distant lands of Europe. When the Chequer and Shekelesh began seizing crucial strategic ports and shattering the established diplomatic protocols, the flow of tin, the undisputed lifeblood of Bronze Age warfare and industry, was instantly and violently severed. Imagine a modern society losing all access to functioning infrastructure, banking, and energy sources overnight. That is the scale of the crisis that gripped the ancient world. Without tin, there is no bronze. Without bronze, armies cannot arm themselves effectively. Tools cannot be made, and the entire magnificent edifice of high civilization begins to crumble into dust. The vast royal palaces and massive temple complexes, which acted as centers of economic redistribution, governance, and centralized storage, suddenly found themselves starved of necessary resources, unable to feed the hundreds of specialized craftsmen, scribes, and administrators who kept the complex machine running smoothly. The archaeological evidence suggests that many major cities, including those in Syria and Canaan, were not sacked by foreign invaders, but burned violently from within by their own desperate, starving populations, turning savagely on the elite ruling classes who could no longer provide for them or guarantee their survival. The chaos mounted, reaching a deafening crescendo in the Egyptian Levant. It was terrifyingly clear that Egypt, the last shining, solitary beacon of the old world, was next on the list for total annihilation. The entire apparatus of the Sea Peoples, not just the warriors, but the families, the cumbersome ox carts loaded with belongings, and the heavy baggage trains, was moving inexorably south along the coastal road, seeking a new homeland in the fertile and untouched Nile Delta. Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, knew with absolute certainty that this was not merely a predictable border skirmish. It was a desperate battle for the very existence and future identity of Egypt itself. The incredible Medinet Habu inscriptions dramatically show the terrified faces of the captured, documenting the sheer magnitude of the invading force stretching across both land and sea, an overwhelming tide of humanity. In the fateful year 1178 BCE, the inevitable and bloody collision occurred. Ramesses III met the gargantuan invasion force in two decisive and brutal engagements. One fierce land battle fought near Jahi, modern Gaza, and a terrifying naval engagement waged in the narrow, critical channels of the Nile Delta, a final stand. The sheer drama captured in the Medinet Habu reliefs is unmatched in ancient art. Egyptian archers raining lethal fire down upon the distinctive round ships of the Sea Peoples. The chaos of brutal hand-to-hand combat on the unstable water, and the final, crushing triumph of the professional Egyptian military machine. Ramesses III claims total and glorious victory, boasting that he overthrew those who invaded his boundaries, trapping them like helpless birds in a net, and utterly obliterating their desperate dreams of settling the fertile delta. But even in his magnificent, glorious boast, there is a profound hint of lasting dread and irrevocable change. He had won the battle, yes, but the war for the old world was undeniably over. The superpowers were reduced to ashes. The sophisticated trade routes were irrevocably dead, and the Peliset, though defeated at the Delta, were already settling firmly into Canaan, establishing a permanent beachhead for the terrifying, chaotic new era known only as the Dark Age. The world had ceased to be. Where once stood glistening palaces powered by the intricate gears of global trade, there was now only dust, silence, and the chilling scent of burnt cedar. But even as the lights of Hattusa and Mycenae were extinguished forever, one magnificent golden beacon still stubbornly refused to be swallowed by the apocalyptic night: the new kingdom of Egypt. This was not survival by strength alone, but by a sheer, desperate, bone-deep will to exist, marshaled by the final great warrior pharaoh of his line, Ramesses III. He stood as the last bulwark against an ocean of chaos, knowing that if Egypt fell, the entire sophisticated structure of the ancient world would be utterly eradicated, leaving nothing behind but primordial savagery. Ramesses III watched the storm approach, a terrifying convergence of broken peoples, driven by famine, ambition, and the sheer momentum of destruction they had already unleashed across the Levant. We know the horror of his struggle because he had the terrifying foresight to carve every single brutal detail onto the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, a permanent, screaming testament to the end of times. Look closely at those stone murals, and you will see the nightmare made real. The chariots are overturned, the archers desperately try to hold the line, and the invaders, the dreaded sea peoples, come on like an unstoppable tide, their distinctive horned helmets and feathered headdresses mocking the orderly cosmos the Egyptians fought to preserve. Ramesses III didn't just face disorganized raiders. He faced a highly coordinated, multi-ethnic war machine. The inscriptions list the fallen before they even reached Egypt's borders, a chilling roll call of nations wiped clean off the map. Arzawa, the kingdom of Alashia, Cyprus, Carchemish, all vanished, swallowed whole by this mysterious coalition of destruction. Then came the Peliset, those terrifying wanderers who would eventually settle and become known to history by a name that still echoes today: the Philistines. And the Checker, ruthless pirates who struck fear into the heart of the maritime cities, along with the Sheridan, those famously enigmatic fighters who wore those terrifying spiked helmets and had perhaps once served as mercenary shock troops for the very empires they were now helping to dismantle. The pharaoh realized that the enemy was not just sailing the seas, they were moving their entire civilization. The inscriptions tell us that the sea peoples brought their women, their children, and their cumbersome ox carts loaded with everything they owned, following the invading armies like a vast, hungry shadow intending not to raid, but to conquer and permanently settle. They were driven by an existential need for land and sustenance, a force more dangerous than any army, because they had nothing left to lose. They had already sacrificed their past and their homes in a desperate bid to carve out a future from the ashes of the great empires. This was total war, fought by peoples who had themselves been victims of the environmental and economic collapse sweeping the globe. The first critical stand was fought inland, known as the Battle of Jahi, likely fought somewhere in southern Canaan, the gateway to Egypt proper. Ramesses III was forced to deploy the absolute totality of his military might, utilizing his crack corps of chariots to smash into the dense, shield-walled formations of the invaders before they could break through the defensive lines and flood the fertile Nile Valley. These were not mere skirmishes. These were engagements of world historical importance, where the fate of monumental architecture, centralized government, and literacy itself hung by the thinnest of threads. Had the pharaoh failed in this naval defense, the sea peoples would have sailed directly into the heart of the Egyptian breadbasket, and the lights would have gone out on the last great Bronze Age kingdom. The Egyptians waited, their ships hidden among the river mouths, ready to spring the trap. As the enemy fleet sailed in, arrogant in their recent victories against all other naval powers, they found themselves instantly entangled in a maelstrom of fire and fury. Egyptian archers rained down thousands of arrows, pinning the enemy crews in their open decks, preventing the fatal boarding actions the sea peoples usually relied upon. Then came the deadly, decisive maneuver. The Egyptian ships, armed with grappling hooks and their own specialized infantry, pulled the sea people's vessels close, turning the naval engagement into a brutal, close-quarters infantry slaughter. The pharaoh's forces utilized fire arrows and javelins to devastating effect, sinking ship after ship until the estuary was choked with the flotsam and the sinking bodies of the shattered invaders. The sea peoples were routed, their momentum finally broken, and Ramesses III had seemingly saved civilization. But the victory was a catastrophic lie. Yes, the immediate threat was repelled, but the economic arteries of Egypt, the vast trade networks it relied upon for essential resources like tin, copper, and timber, were permanently severed by the widespread destruction that still scarred the Mediterranean. The true collapse was not merely the sound of invading armies. It was the eerie silence that followed. This was the terrifying systems collapse theory made real. The sea peoples were the symptoms, perhaps even the trigger, but the deep-seated rot had already set in, driven by generations of drought and a fragile, interconnected economy built upon too few specialized resources. Imagine the domino effect that doomed the world. Drought causes famine in Anatolia. Famine causes mass migration and internal revolts. The migration disrupts the vital tin route coming from the east, which instantly halts Brahms' production in Mycenae and Cyprus, the engine rooms of the ancient military machine. No bronze means no weapons, no tools, and no capacity to fight back or even feed the massive urban populations. The trade routes that had maintained high culture for 400 years suddenly went dark, and the complex diplomacy of the age vanished overnight. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy cities, they destroyed the very operating system of the Late Bronze Age, plunging the entire region into a dark age that would last 1,000 years. We stand now at the precipice of the impossible question. If they brought down the greatest empires the world had ever known, why did they leave behind no monument, no capital city, no single tomb inscribed with their triumph? The answer is a chilling testament to their nature. They were not nation builders. They were nation enders. The only clues we possess are the terrified scribblings of their victims, specifically the monumental, terrified carvings on the funerary temple walls of Pharaoh Ramses III at Medinet Habu. Here, carved in stone for eternity, are the names, or perhaps the dreaded aliases, of the very apocalypse that swept across the known world. This is where the true forensic detective work begins, sorting through the shattered pottery and the terrified royal decrees to assign real identities to the relentless phantoms that stalked the seas and the dusty roads of the Near East. We must peel back the layers of Egyptian propaganda to find the terrifying truth. The Egyptian record identifies a coalition of at least 5 primary groups that formed the core of the catastrophe, a terrifying alliance of the dispossessed and the highly militarized. First among them, the terrifying Sheridan, often depicted in their instantly recognizable horned helmets, carrying enormous round shields and long, sophisticated slashing swords, weapons far superior to the heavy, short bronze arms of the Mycenaeans they systematically dismantled. Were they pirates from the island of Sardinia, as some dare suggest, given the linguistic similarities? Or were they the ultimate betrayal, elite Aegean guards who had served the palace systems for generations, only to turn against their masters when the system began to starve? Their sudden appearance in the service of the pharaoh, and then later as his ultimate, nearly fatal enemy, suggests a terrifying, adaptable ruthlessness. Then there are the Peliset, perhaps the most infamous name whispered across the ruins of the Levant, a name that echoes down through thousands of years of history. These were the people who gave their name to the entire region they settled in their bloody wake, a place we would eventually call Palestine. Their identity is a historical and geopolitical bombshell that continues to resonate today. The later world would remember them in fragmented form as the biblical Philistines, the eternal, relentless enemy of ancient Israel, but history reveals they were simply highly militarized, deeply organized refugees, survivors who managed to carve out a brutal new existence when everyone else perished in the flame. They carried the memory and the sophisticated pottery of the Aegean in their ox carts, a dark and powerful inheritance of the sea. Alongside them marched the Teresh, a name that tantalizingly links them to the later Etruscans of Italy, another sophisticated, non-Italic culture that suddenly appeared in the West during this chaotic period. This theory, if proven true, means the Sea Peoples didn't just cause a collapse. They laid the foundation for future Western civilization in the wreckage of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Lucca, known for their ancient, vicious reputation as relentless pirates operating out of the Lycian coast of Anatolia, whose continuous and destructive raids had been plaguing the Hittite Empire for generations. These were the pure opportunists, the wolves who smelled blood in the water and joined the feast, seeking only plunder and chaos. But the most terrifying question that archaeology and history must confront is not who these individual groups were, but why they moved in such a devastating, coordinated, and massive migration. What force massive enough could organize the destruction of an entire world order? The prevailing theory is as stark and relentless as the burnt earth they left behind. The sky itself. A generation-long megadrought, an environmental collapse evidenced in the tree rings, the ice core samples, and the lake bed sediments taken from around the globe, choked the very life out of the delicate late Bronze Age agricultural and economic system. Harvests failed repeatedly. The crucial trade routes that moved life-saving food broke down, and the elaborate systems of debt and redistribution that held the palace economies together shattered instantly. The Sea Peoples, in this catastrophic vision, were not just organized raiders seeking bronze. They were starving climate refugees, desperate armies driven by the primal, inescapable need for sustenance. They came not for gold, but for grain, and they brought their entire families in cumbersome ox carts, ready to conquer or die trying. Their movement was an act of global desperation. Imagine the unbearable tension within those opulent palace walls as the drought worsened. While the kings stored massive quantities of grain in massive silos and hoarded bronze weapons for their elite guards, the peasant class, the very foundation of the Mycenaean, Cypriot, and Hittite systems, starved. When the strangers, the Sheridan and Pelisset, arrived, they often found willing local allies among the desperate populace. This wasn't just an external invasion. It was a societal explosion, where the oppressed rose up to tear down the very unequal structures that had failed to feed them. The Sea Peoples may have simply been the highly efficient match that lit the accumulated tinder of decades of systemic social and environmental injustice. This suggests the final, chilling truth. The Sea Peoples did not entirely destroy the late Bronze Age world. They merely administered the final, fatal, swift blow to a civilization that was already committing violent suicide through its own rigid, brittle, and deeply unequal structure. The great palaces of Mycenae and Pylos fell not just to foreign swords, but to the desperate, hungry rage of their own forgotten citizens. Regardless of their precise mixed origin, Whether they were Mycenaean exiles, Sardinian mercenaries, or simply the desperate poor of Anatolia, their collective identity remains terrifyingly fluid, a composite force of destruction. They were the ultimate anti-civilization, defined only by their destructive, relentless trajectory. They are the historical equivalent of a geological event, a tidal wave of humanity, a massive force created by deep, unseen societal and environmental pressures, identifiable only by the monumental wreckage they systematically left behind. They were the perfect storm of famine, migration, technological shift, and systemic breakdown, concentrated into a single, terrifying, relentless banner. The question of who they were may never be fully, definitively answered, but we can now trace their terrifying, agonizing path of destruction, city by city, beginning with the great Syrian port that frantically tried and tragically failed to warn the world, the lost city of Ugarit. Ugarit, the glorious trading hub, the jewel of the Syrian coast, was not just wealthy, it was the world's frantic canary in the coal mine, singing its last desperate warning note into the howling wind. As the apocalyptic storm of the sea peoples gathered catastrophic strength, the magnificent walls of this metropolis, which had stood proud for millennia, began to feel the first agonizing tremors of the greatest collapse humanity had ever known. We have the proof, etched in the hardened clay, baked forever by the very inferno that consumed their final moments. The terrifying, desperate pleas of the last king, Hammurabi, preserved for us like historical screams trapped in time. King Hammurabi, whose name is now forever synonymous with failure and tragedy, sat paralyzed in his palace, his ink-stained stylus shaking in his hand, trying desperately to coordinate a defense against a phantom enemy no one could truly comprehend. His final letters are not merely historical documents, they are raw, unfiltered terror. He wrote to Suppiluliuma II, the weary and distracted Hittite emperor, begging for immediate relief, only to receive cold, indifferent demands for Ugaritic ships and soldiers to defend the distant Hittite heartland, instead of his own immediate shores. The sheer, crushing, heart-stopping irony. Ugarit was being brutally forced to die, protecting the very empire that had callously refused to lift a single finger to protect it. But the most chilling correspondence, the one that truly encapsulates the scale of the civilization-ending panic, was sent in a final, frantic rush to the king of Wallachia, the ruler of modern Cyprus, just days, perhaps hours, before the inevitable end. Hammurabi's message was brief but devastating. My father, behold, the enemy ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? He was utterly exposed, drained of all military resources, waiting for the slaughter. The king of Wallachia, likely facing his own imminent, terrifying collapse on his island kingdom, sent back a response that was brutally honest and utterly devoid of hope, confirming what Hammurabi already knew deep in his soul. The ships were coming. The destruction was absolute, and no help was remotely available from any corner of the ancient world.
The final assault on Ugarit was swift, terrifying, and profoundly merciless. Archaeologists digging through the layers of destruction found something even more disturbing than simple ruin. The city was systematically and meticulously looted of every valuable artifact, suggesting a highly organized, professional, and calculating force, far beyond just a wandering band of disorganized pirates looking for quick riches.
When the Sea Peoples finally breached the massive walls, whether through siege warfare, overwhelming force, or internal treachery, the organized life of Ugarit ceased instantly and forever. The fires that erupted across the once glorious city were so fierce, so consuming, that they literally baked the thousands of clay tablets stored in the royal archives, unintentionally preserving the precise, heartbreaking evidence of their own destruction for 32 centuries, for us to now stare into the face of true despair. We often talk about the Bronze Age collapse as if it were a slow, protracted decline over decades, but for Ugarit, it was not a decline at all. It was a sudden, violent, catastrophic stop. The last thing the citizens saw was the smoke blotting out the Mediterranean sky. The last sound they heard was the high-pitched, unrecognizable war cry of 1,000 foreign tongues. And the last feeling was the earth itself turning to searing ash beneath their feet. With Ugarit instantly reduced to nothing more than a smoking, desolate grave, the terrifying armada and land armies of the Sea Peoples did not pause for even a moment to celebrate their devastating victory. They were a relentless, unstoppable tide, immediately pivoting and moving south along the Levantine coast, consuming every major port city and agricultural hub that stood in their devastating path, leaving behind a horrifying trail of absolute silence and profound ruin. Al-Alaq, another absolutely crucial trade center further inland on the Orontes River, was next on the death list. Its ruins show the exact same, uniquely devastating signature: total and complete destruction by fire, followed by immediate and permanent abandonment. The sheer coordination and speed required to strike multiple well-defended cities across a massive territory simultaneously suggests a unified command and a singular, terrifying purpose, even if the soldiers themselves were a chaotic, multi-ethnic mix of identities. The traditional, sluggish empires were completely paralyzed, unable to grasp the magnitude of the threat or respond effectively. The great Hittites were too busy fighting complex proxy wars and managing debilitating internal rebellions to save their distant Syrian vassal states. Egypt, meanwhile, was watching nervously from its secure southern border, clinging desperately and foolishly to the illusion of control, believing against all evidence that the great burning wall of northern Syria would somehow magically hold the existential tide back and protect them. But the wall didn't just crack under pressure. It violently dissolved into dust and chaos. The Sea Peoples weren't merely intent on destroying individual cities.
They were focused on systematically destroying the entire supply chain, the cultural network, the economic infrastructure, and the entire political geography of the ancient world. Every grain shipment burned, every diplomatic message intercepted and rendered useless, every merchant vessel sunk in the dark sea was a devastating tremor felt thousands of miles away, from the palaces of Mycenae in Greece all the way to the sprawling temples of Memphis in the south. The total, sudden destruction of the Syrian buffer zone signaled the imminent arrival of the apocalypse directly on the doorstep of the only remaining major power in the region: glorious, wealthy Egypt. Pharaoh Merneptah, decades earlier, had faced a previous coalition of Libyan and northern invaders, but this colossal threat was fundamentally different and far more existential. This was not a border skirmish. This was the total annihilation of civilization itself, marching relentlessly toward the Nile. The terror was palpable, spreading far faster than the invaders themselves could march. Imagine the broken, stumbling refugees, the pitiful remnants of Ugarit and Alalak, desperately moving south, carrying nothing but ghastly tales of unspeakable horror. Tales that served as a far more effective psychological weapon than any bronze sword they wielded. Their stories were the first chilling whispers of inevitable doom, warning the complacent Egyptians that their golden age of splendor was about to collide head-on with an iron-willed, desperate, and utterly merciless force coming straight out of the sea. They were marching straight towards the wealthy breadbasket of the ancient world, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing left in the ravaged Levant to stop them from reaching the promised land. The shadow had fallen across the entire Mediterranean, a darkness so profound it swallowed the legacies of Troy, Mycenae, and mighty Hatti itself. Now, the final bastion, the ancient golden kingdom of Kemet, stood exposed, its very foundations shaking under the distant rhythmic thunder of approaching doom. The pharaoh who inherited this apocalyptic stage was not a man of peace, but a warrior carved from granite, Ramesses III, the last great hope of the new kingdom. He looked out over his fertile lands, lands that had known unbroken peace and unparalleled wealth for centuries, and saw only the dust clouds of refugees staggering south, bringing tales of unthinkable horror, cities melting into sand, kings executed, and the gods themselves silenced. Ramesses knew the score. This was not a border skirmish. This was the end of days knocking on the fortified gates of Thebes, and he was absolutely the only person left to answer the door. Ramesses III, often unfairly remembered as a pale imitation of his powerful namesake, understood that the sheer scale of the collapse was unprecedented. This was not a punitive raid. This was a people movement, a ravenous migration seeking new lands to settle after their own worlds had burned. He had witnessed the maps of his intelligence officers turn red, province after province vanishing from the Egyptian sphere of influence like a snuffed candle, stretching from the Aegean to the shores of Canaan. The defense had to be total, and it had to be immediate. Ramesses III was not going to wait for the storm to break upon his capital. He initiated a military mobilization of a scale unseen since perhaps the time of Ramesses II. But this was a defense driven by sheer, desperate survival, not imperial ambition. Every able-bodied man, from the farmers of the Fayoum to the garrison soldiers stationed deep in Nubia, was called up to defend the precious Nile Delta, the breadbasket of the entire empire.
The chariots, the pride of the Egyptian army, were rigorously maintained, their bronze fittings gleaming menacingly in the desert sun, ready for the final, brutal charge. Supplies were stockpiled, and the aging fortifications along the eastern frontier, which had been left to languish during the long peace, were hurriedly repaired and reinforced with new bastions of sun-dried brick and stone. The ancient Egyptian war machine groaned, slowly turning its massive gears for one final existential struggle against an unknown, terrifying enemy. The intelligence reports were grimly accurate. The Sea Peoples, specifically the Peliset, the Checker, and the Sheridan, were not just raiding, they were migrating, bringing their families, their ox carts, and their relentless iron resolve. A literal land train of destruction marching relentlessly toward the fertile promise of the Nile. They hit the eastern delta like a tidal wave, bypassing the old fortifications and engaging the advanced Egyptian units in savage, close-quarters combat. The battle for the Nile frontier was a horrifying bloodbath, a clash between the ancient Bronze Order, symbolized by the heavy Egyptian chariots, and the new, terrifying wave of disruption, marked by the distinctive, sometimes iron-tipped weapons and strange, high-crested helmets of the invaders. Ramesses III understood that war was also fought in the minds of men, especially when facing such an unnerving foe. He commissioned monumental inscriptions, instantly recognizable by scholars thousands of years later, at his grand mortuary temple of Medinet Habu. These weren't just records, they were a battle cry etched in stone, depicting the terrifying invaders, men with horned helmets and strange shields, being crushed under the wheels of Egyptian justice. Ramesses proclaimed that the god Amun-Ra himself had commanded the defense, promising divine fire upon the enemies who dared to defile the two lands, projecting absolute confidence to mask the sheer terror gripping the heart of Egypt. But the true, absolute danger was not just on land. It was coming from the water, the very element that Egypt had always relied upon for protection and commerce. The Sea Peoples were masters of the turbulent waves, and their fleet, a swarm of swift, unfamiliar vessels, was sailing straight for the heart of the delta, aiming to breach the Nile mouths and land troops directly behind the main Egyptian lines, flanking the land forces and forcing a collapse. Ramesses III knew that losing control of the coast meant instant, catastrophic defeat, allowing the invaders to seize the vital ports and choke the supply lines of the main army. This necessitated the final, desperate gamble, a massive naval confrontation in the confined waters where the Nile met the unforgiving sea, a battle that would determine whether the new kingdom survived or became just another forgotten ruin, like Ugarit and Kati. The pharaoh personally oversaw the preparations, meticulous and frenzied. Chains were stretched across the narrowest channels to restrict enemy movement, creating deadly bottlenecks designed specifically to ensnare the Sea People's lighter, faster ships. Specialized marine units, armed with devastating composite bow and arrow volleys, were positioned along the banks and aboard the heavier Egyptian vessels, ready to unleash hell upon the trapped invaders.
The strategy was simple, brutal, and utterly necessary. Trap the swift Sea People's vessels in a bottleneck and drown them in arrows and fire, preventing any landing parties from ever reaching the Delta shore. The anticipation was palpable, a suffocating tension that hung over the entire coastline. The fate of the entire Bronze Age, the culmination of 300 years of glorious civilization, rested on the ability of the Egyptian fleet to hold back the relentless, apocalyptic tide.